In the crowded, twisting streets of Prague, under the shadow of Gothic spires and Baroque facades, a boy was born on July 3, 1883, whose name would one day echo like a whisper of dread across the entire world. He was not born into poverty nor into greatness, but into a peculiar middle ground, the household of a Jewish merchant who had clawed his way upward from rural obscurity and who now demanded from his son the same brutal strength that had carried him to respectability. This boy was Franz Kafka, and from the very beginning, the house he grew up in was both shelter and prison. His father, Hermann Kafka, was a towering man, both physically and emotionally. A self-made merchant who ran a shop of fancy goods in Prague, Hermann embodied everything that Franz was not. Loud, confident, practical, impatient with weakness, he radiated authority like a soldier on parade. To him, the world was simple. Work hard, fight harder, never show softness. His son, thin, pale, fragile, seemed almost a mockery of these ideals. From the first years of his life, Franz grew up under a gaze that judged him harshly, a gaze that could silence him without a word. His mother, Julie, was gentle, cultivated, yet subdued by the overwhelming presence of her husband. She offered affection, but never protection. To Franz, this was perhaps the first bitter truth of life, that even love could be silenced by power. Already as a child, he saw in his own home the contradiction that would haunt his writing, the eternal clash between tenderness and domination, between the fragile and the brutal. Prague itself became the stage of his imagination. It was a city of contradictions, a labyrinth of medieval alleys where Jewish synagogues stood in the shadows of Catholic cathedrals, where German culture mixed uneasily with Czech nationalism, and where every corner seemed filled with mystery. To a boy as sensitive as Franz, the city was both enchanting and suffocating. He wandered through its crooked streets as though trapped inside a dream, absorbing the atmosphere of secrecy and oppression that would one day color all his stories. From the earliest years, Kafka felt out of place. He lacked the strength of other boys, shied away from rough games, and recoiled from the mocking laughter of his peers. Instead, he clung to books. Stories became his refuge, a world where he could escape the constant pressure of his father's expectations. But even in those pages he sensed the shadow of guilt, the feeling that to lose himself in imagination was a betrayal of the harsh discipline demanded of him. At night, his imagination turned against him. His dreams were filled with images that would later become the substance of his work. Endless corridors, giant figures looming over him, mysterious trials without explanation, punishments without crime. Sleep did not bring peace, it brought rehearsal. Kafka was rehearsing even as a child for the life he would write down in years to come. These early years were a paradox. Outwardly, Franz was the son of a prosperous merchant, well cared for, fed, clothed, and educated. But inwardly, he lived in terror of a father whose voice thundered louder than any punishment, and in longing for a mother who could not shield him. Already, he felt condemned to be a stranger, not only in society, but in his own family. It is here, in this oppressive childhood home of Prague, that the seeds of Kafka's work were planted. The themes of guilt, authority, fear, and isolation were not inventions of his adult imagination. They were the very atmosphere of his childhood. He was a boy already sentenced to feel like a criminal in his own house, and it was only a matter of time before this feeling would spill into the pages of his notebooks. But how does a child condemned to silence find a voice? And when that voice finally emerges, will it bring liberation, or will it only deepen the sense of being trapped? Franz Kafka entered school not as a child eager to learn, but as a boy already carrying the invisible chains of fear. His father's expectations weighed on him with the same crushing force as the stone facades of Prague's schools, where the language of instruction was German, though the city itself breathed in Czech. From the beginning, Franz was caught between worlds: Jewish at home, German at school, Czech in the streets. It was a triple exile, a constant reminder that he belonged fully nowhere. In the classroom, his intelligence shone quickly. Teachers noted his ability to read and memorize with astonishing speed. He grasped ideas that left other children struggling. He should have been proud, but instead, each success felt like another debt to his father, another reason why any future failure would be punished more harshly. Hermann Kafka did not celebrate achievement as joy. He treated it as proof that more could be demanded. For Franz, every good grade became not relief, but the sharpening of a blade that hovered above him. The father's judgment was not always spoken aloud. Often it was simply a look, a glare that silenced the boy more effectively than any beating. In his later letter to his father, Kafka would recall the terror of being shouted at for minor faults, of being locked outside on the balcony as punishment, trembling in the night. At school, this fear lingered. He entered the classroom like a defendant before a tribunal, already guilty of something he could not name. And yet, Franz excelled. He learned Latin, German, French, and even some Czech, though the mixture of languages around him left him with a strange dislocation. His mother tongue was German, but the streets around him shouted in Czech, and in the synagogue he heard Hebrew prayers. Language itself became unstable, fractured, a theme that would later saturate his writing. For Kafka, words were never entirely secure. They were masks, shifting and unreliable, just like the people who wielded them. The other boys sensed his difference. His thin frame, his pale complexion, his shyness made him a target for mockery. He was not athletic, not loud, not quick with jokes. While they laughed and played, Franz withdrew, clutching his books like shields. If they excluded him, he let them. If they teased him, he lowered his head. The isolation that would mark his adulthood already defined his childhood, always watching, always observing, rarely participating. But in his solitude, something grew. Franz devoured literature with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Goethe, Schiller, Flaubert, and Dostoevsky became companions more vivid than his classmates. In their words, he found both refuge and torment. They showed him that literature could capture the deepest truths of the human soul, but they also made him painfully aware of his own inadequacy. Could he ever measure up to these giants? Could his fragile voice ever carry such weight? Even as a boy, he doubted himself. At home, the war with his father continued silently. Hermann Kafka respected Franz's academic achievements, but dismissed his interest in books and writing as weakness. For Hermann, a man's worth was measured by strength, by business, by practical success. Franz's sensitive nature was a disappointment, almost a disgrace. Every time the boy reached for a book instead of helping in the shop, every time he showed hesitation instead of boldness, the gulf widened. Kafka's childhood was not only a battle to pass exams, it was a lifelong trial to prove his existence in the eyes of a father who never truly accepted him. The pressure manifested in Franz's body. He suffered frequent illnesses, fevers, and headaches. His stomach churned with anxiety, his chest tightened with unspoken dread. In later years, he would often describe his body as a kind of prison, weak and unreliable, never allowing him to feel at ease. Already as a student, he felt betrayed by his own flesh, as though even his body were siding with his father against him. Yet the more the world outside oppressed him, the sharper his inner gaze became. He noticed details others overlooked: the way a teacher's cough interrupted silence, the way a classmate's hand trembled when called to recite, the way the school corridors echoed like tunnels leading nowhere. For Franz, these were not trivial observations. They were revelations. The world was not solid. It was fragile, absurd, frightening. School was supposed to prepare children for life, but for Kafka it prepared him for literature, teaching him that behind every rule and every lesson there lurked an invisible authority, waiting to judge and condemn. By the time Franz completed his secondary schooling, he had become a paradox. Outwardly a model student, inwardly a boy suffocating under guilt and fear. His notebooks were filled with sketches of strange, unsettling tales, stories of men trapped in impossible situations, of accusations without cause, of people who woke one morning to find their world incomprehensibly changed. These were not yet finished works, but the seeds were planted. The themes that would one day define the trial and the metamorphosis were already crawling in his imagination. When he finally passed his exams with distinction, earning entry into Prague's prestigious Charles University, his family celebrated. His father took pride in the achievement, as though it reflected his own discipline rather than his son's suffering. For Franz, the milestone was hollow. He had succeeded, yes, but not on his own terms. The victory belonged to the father who demanded it, not to the boy who had endured it. The applause of teachers felt empty when, at home, the thunderous voice of Hermann Kafka could drown out every note of praise. Thus ended the school years of Franz Kafka, outwardly a triumph, inwardly a quiet devastation. He had survived classrooms, exams, and ridicule, but he had not escaped the shadow of his father. If anything, the shadow had grown larger, following him into the next chapter of his life. As he prepared to step into university, Kafka carried with him not only knowledge and books, but a gnawing sense of guilt, fragility, and estrangement from the world around him. He was now a young man, but the question remained the same. Could he ever escape the gaze that judged him everywhere? Or was he condemned to remain forever a defendant in a trial that had no end? When Franz Kafka walked beneath the stone arches of Charles University in Prague in the autumn of 1901, he did so with the heavy steps of a young man already resigned. He had dreamed of literature, of philosophy, of giving shape to the strange visions that haunted his nights. But his father, Hermann, demanded something solid, something useful, something that would not shame the family. For a brief moment, Franz enrolled in chemistry. He quickly abandoned it, finding no spark in beakers and formulas. Soon he turned to law, not because it called to him, but because it was long, demanding, and practical, the sort of career that pleased fathers and secured respectable futures. From the beginning, the lectures left him cold. Endless legal codes, case precedents, and procedures washed over him like meaningless incantations. Yet Franz endured. He took meticulous notes, passed his examinations, and wore the mask of a dutiful student. Beneath that mask, however, another Franz was waking. The Franz who scribbled fragments of stories in notebooks, who studied philosophy and literature late into the night, who felt that the law was not a path to truth, but a labyrinth without exit. At the university, a chance meeting altered his life. Max Brod. Brod was everything Franz was not, outgoing, confident, quick with words, endlessly optimistic. Where Kafka doubted every sentence he wrote, Brod saw brilliance and urged him onward. The two became inseparable companions, walking the streets of Prague at night, talking for hours in smoky cafes. Around them gathered a small circle of friends. Felix Welch, Oscar Baum, and others, young men eager to debate art, philosophy, Zionism, politics, and the future of Europe. It was in this circle that Kafka began to share pieces of his writing. Tentatively at first, short sketches, strange, dreamlike fragments that startled his friends with their originality. Brod recognized immediately what Kafka could not. Here was a voice unlike any other, a vision that peeled back the surface of reality and revealed its absurd machinery. Franz dismissed his own work as insignificant, but Brod urged him to continue, to publish, to trust the gift that tormented him. Still, Kafka lived a double life. By day, he studied the law, attending classes with dutiful regularity. By night, he filled his journals with stories of men pursued by unknown authorities, of families turning against their own, of transformations and trials that made no sense yet felt truer than ordinary life. He never showed these to his professors. They belonged to another realm, one that the rational world of law could never comprehend. The contradiction grew unbearable. On one side, there was the dutiful son and student, moving toward a secure career. On the other, there was the secret writer, whose very act of writing felt like rebellion. For Kafka, every page was a betrayal of his father's world and a betrayal of the ordinary future laid before him. Yet every page was also survival. Writing, he confessed in his diary, is the axe for the frozen sea within me. Without it, he would suffocate. During these years, his health began to falter. He was prone to migraines, fevers, and digestive troubles. His thin frame and pale face set him apart from his classmates. He carried his fragility like a brand, convinced that his weak body was proof of his inadequacy. And yet, he pushed himself relentlessly. He wanted to write, but he also wanted to hide, to dissolve into anonymity. It was this constant push and pull between exposure and concealment, between ambition and fear, that gave his early writings their intensity. By 1906, Kafka had completed his doctorate in law. To the outside world, it was a triumph. His family beamed with pride. His father held his head a little higher. Franz wore the academic gown, posed for photographs, accepted congratulations. Inside, however, he felt only hollowness. The degree was a mask, another form of disguise. It was the writer in him, not the lawyer, who burned to live. But that writer still lived in the shadows, unrecognized even by himself. The years at Charles University had given Kafka more than a degree. They had given him a voice, though he barely dared to admit it, and a friend in Max Brod who would one day ensure that the world heard it. But for now, Kafka left the university as he had entered it, quiet, doubtful, divided. He carried a diploma in one hand and a stack of secret notebooks in the other. One was meant for his father, the other was meant for no one, or so he thought. As he prepared to enter the adult world, the question lingered. Would Franz Kafka live as the dutiful lawyer his father demanded, or as the haunted writer his soul required? The conflict between these two destinies was no longer avoidable. It was already tearing him apart. In 1907, Franz Kafka stepped into the grey corridors of adulthood. The fresh doctor of law needed to earn his place in the world, and the world, as his father and society agreed, meant work, respectable, stable, dull. After a brief stint in a private insurance company, he secured a position at the Workers' Accident Insurance Institute in Prague, a government agency tasked with compensating industrial injuries. It was a job of ledgers, reports, and endless rules. By day, Kafka sat at his desk surrounded by piles of case files, factory workers crushed by machines, men blinded by chemical burns, laborers maimed by gears and pistons. He calculated pensions, weighed legal obligations, and drafted reports in precise German prose. His supervisors admired his efficiency. His colleagues respected his quiet reliability. To the outside world, he was the model of a conscientious civil servant. But beneath this mask of bureaucratic competence, Kafka felt suffocated. The job was respectable, but it was also a theater of absurdity. The injured workers became case numbers. Their suffering was transformed into mathematical formulas, tables, and percentages. The bureaucracy claimed to protect them, yet in truth, it crushed them with paperwork and rules, leaving them trapped in a maze of procedures. Kafka saw it all. He absorbed it, and in his imagination it became something more, the machinery of authority, faceless and inescapable, grinding human beings into dust. If the daylight hours belonged to bureaucracy, the nights belonged to something else entirely. After long days in the office, Kafka returned to his room, lit his lamp and sat down to write. He often began at 10 or 11 at night, when the city was quiet and his body exhausted. For him, exhaustion was necessary. Only then could he bypass his own fear and self-censorship. He wrote feverishly until dawn, sometimes producing dozens of pages, sometimes only a paragraph. Then, as the sun rose, he collapsed into uneasy sleep, only to wake and drag himself back to the office once more. This rhythm was brutal, and his fragile body paid the price. Insomnia gnawed at him. Migraines throbbed behind his eyes. His stomach rebelled, his chest tightened, his nerves frayed. Yet he could not stop. Writing was not a choice. It was compulsion, a necessity as urgent as breathing. He confided to his diary, "Writing sustains me, but it is also a punishment." Each page he produced seemed both salvation and torment. During these years, Kafka began publishing his first serious works. In 1912, his collection Meditation, also called Contemplation, appeared. Short sketches of city life, brief glimpses of solitude, guilt, and dread. The public hardly noticed, but Kafka's circle of friends sensed something extraordinary. Max Brod, always his champion, urged him to publish more, to believe in his own genius. But Kafka wavered, doubting every word. To him, his stories were grotesque fragments, imperfect mirrors of the chaos in his mind. He could not imagine they might one day speak for an entire century. It was in this same year, 1912, that he wrote one of his most haunting works, The Judgment. In a single night of furious writing, he poured onto the page the story of a son condemned to death by his father. Critics later hailed it as the breakthrough of Kafka's voice. For Kafka himself, it felt like a revelation, as though the act of writing had opened a wound he could never again close. The irony was sharp. By day, Franz Kafka served the state, documenting accidents and enforcing regulations. By night, he dissected the very absurdities that filled his daylight hours, transmuting them into visions of labyrinths, courts, and condemnations without cause. Two lives coexisted in him, the dutiful bureaucrat and the doomed writer, and the strain of living both was tearing him apart. Even in these early stories, the themes that would define him were clear: guilt without explanation, punishment without crime, authority without face. He was not inventing them from imagination alone. He was transcribing the atmosphere of his own existence. At work, at home, in society, he always felt accused, judged, and condemned. Writing was the only courtroom where he could both confess and resist. But how long could he endure this double existence? How long could his frail body sustain days of bureaucracy and nights of torment? The question pressed upon him with each passing year, even as his writing grew stronger, darker, more inevitable. The bureaucrat was feeding the writer, but soon the writer would consume the man entirely. In August 1912, one evening at Max Brod's apartment in Prague, Franz Kafka was introduced to a young woman from Berlin named Felice Bauer. At first glance, she seemed ordinary, perhaps even plain: serious eyes, a sharp nose, a practical manner that spoke of efficiency rather than romance. Yet something about her presence struck Kafka like a thunderclap. He later wrote in his diary that she appeared to him as a figure of destiny. He was 30, unmarried, painfully shy, and convinced that love was forever out of reach. Suddenly, here was a possibility, a spark of life intruding into his carefully walled-off solitude. But for Kafka, love was never simple. What followed was not a conventional courtship, but a storm of letters, hundreds, sometimes thousands of words at a time, written late at night with the same feverish intensity he poured into his stories. Felice became not only a woman in his life, but the audience for his confessions. He bared to her his fears, his anxieties, his nightly routines, his doubts about himself, and his longing for connection. The relationship unfolded largely on paper, a river of correspondence in which Franz seemed both lover and prosecutor, pleading his own case and condemning himself at once. The letters reveal a man torn apart. Kafka adored Felice's warmth and intelligence, yet every time the thought of marriage grew near, panic consumed him. Marriage to him was not a sanctuary but a threat. He feared it would strangle his fragile writing life, rob him of the solitude he believed was essential to his art. In one letter, he confessed that he saw himself as crushed between two millstones. On one side, his need for love and human closeness. On the other, his merciless devotion to literature. In 1914, after years of hesitation, he proposed. Felice accepted. For a brief moment, it seemed that Kafka might finally escape his solitude, that he might reconcile the ordinary life of a husband with the extraordinary burden of his imagination. But almost immediately cracks appeared. The engagement felt to Kafka like a trap, a cage closing around him. He vacillated endlessly, professing love one day, recoiling in dread the next. His letters to Felice became self-accusations, catalogues of his inadequacy, rehearsals of failure. The engagement collapsed, then revived, then collapsed again. Twice he placed a ring on her finger. Twice he pulled away. Felice, humiliated and wounded, eventually withdrew for good. For Kafka, the break was devastating, but also inevitable. He could not marry, not because he did not love, but because he loved too fearfully. To bind himself to another human being felt like a betrayal of the strange, consuming vocation that demanded every hour of his nights. It was during this tumultuous period, in the very heat of his anguish over Felice, that Kafka wrote one of his most enduring works, The Metamorphosis, 1915. The story of Gregor Samsa, who wakes one morning to find himself transformed into a monstrous insect, rejected by his family and left to waste away, was more than allegory. It was Franz himself, the son who disappointed his father, the fiancé who horrified his lover, the man who felt alien even in his own skin. Gregor's body became grotesque, just as Kafka felt his own body to be weak, unworthy, shameful. Gregor's slow death mirrored the writer's conviction that love and family would never accept him as he truly was. The collapse of his relationship with Felice did not silence him. On the contrary, it deepened his writing. His pain, his guilt, his sense of estrangement all found their way onto the page. The failed engagement became fuel for stories of alienation that would one day speak to millions. Yet for Kafka himself, the cost was brutal. He ended not with a wife and children, but with a deepened solitude, haunted by the thought that he was incapable of ordinary happiness. Felice went on to marry another man, to live a stable life in Berlin. Kafka, meanwhile, retreated further into his night writing, his diaries, his fragile body. He had chosen or been forced into his path, not that of marriage and family, but of loneliness and art. Still, the question lingered, tormenting him with every word he wrote. Had he rejected Felice to preserve his writing, or had his writing rejected her, choosing itself as the only true companion of his life? The year was 1914, and while Europe was plunging into the catastrophe of the Great War, Franz Kafka found himself ensnared in a catastrophe of his own. His engagement to Felice Bauer had disintegrated in public humiliation, a so-called tribunal staged in a Berlin hotel where friends and family interrogated him about his hesitation, his inadequacy, his betrayal. Kafka described it later as a trial in which he was both accused and condemned, stripped of dignity before witnesses. Out of this torment, his most famous work began to take form, The Trial. By night, in his room in Prague, he wrote with furious intensity the story of Joseph K. as a man arrested one morning without having done anything wrong, poured from him like confession and prophecy. Joseph K. is never told his crime, never shown his accusers, never given a fair chance. He is trapped in a labyrinth of endless hearings, corrupt officials, meaningless rules. His struggle is hopeless, his end inevitable. In Joseph K., Kafka captured not only the absurd machinery of authority, but his own lifelong sense of guilt and condemnation by his father, by society, by love, and by life itself. But while he wrote about a trial of the soul, his body was facing its own verdict. In 1917, after months of exhaustion and coughing fits, Kafka awoke one morning to blood on his pillow. The diagnosis was clear and devastating: tuberculosis. At 34, he now carried a death sentence. Doctors ordered rest, sanatoriums, fresh air in the countryside. Kafka, who had always felt weak, now knew his weakness had a name. The disease reshaped his existence. He took long leaves from his insurance job, retreating to rural spas and mountain sanatoriums. His sisters and friends worried over him. Felice drifted definitively out of his life. His mother hovered with tenderness, his father with impatience. Kafka himself oscillated between resignation and defiance. At times, he confessed that death felt like a relief, a final escape from the endless struggle. At other times, he wrote with renewed urgency, as though every story might be his last. It was in these years that his creativity reached new heights. Alongside The Trial, he produced In the Penal Colony, a tale of a machine that inscribes punishment directly into the flesh of its victims. He drafted stories of isolation, cruelty, and absurdity with a clarity sharpened by his illness. Tuberculosis hollowed his body, but it also stripped away hesitation. Writing became both his rebellion and his requiem. The irony was cruel. By day, the Insurance Institute, where he still nominally worked, existed to protect laborers from industrial accidents, a bureaucracy meant to compensate for wounds and death. By night, Kafka exposed in his fiction the futility of such systems, the way institutions dehumanize those they claim to serve. He was both a cog in the machine and its greatest critic, and all the while his illness deepened. He grew thinner, weaker, plagued by fevers and insomnia. His diaries from this time are filled with despair. He called himself a cage searching for a bird. He felt trapped not only by the state or by his father, but by his own body, which betrayed him daily. The trial of Joseph K. was no longer only allegory, it was reality. His own body had become the courtroom, his lungs the judge, his blood the evidence. Yet even as tuberculosis advanced, Kafka clung to his pen. The more his body failed, the stronger his voice grew. He no longer wrote to seek recognition. He believed he would never see true fame, but to leave a trace, a testimony of what it meant to live under constant invisible judgment. By the end of the decade, the man who had once been merely a nervous clerk in Prague had transformed into something else entirely. A prophet of the absurd, a writer whose nightmares mirrored the world's approaching horrors. He was condemned, yes, but condemned to write, until he could no longer breathe. The question now was how long he could endure. Would the disease silence him before he finished his visions, or would his visions outlast the frail vessel of his body? By 1920, Franz Kafka was 37 years old, frail, coughing blood, his body thinned by years of tuberculosis. His nights were still consumed by writing, but his life felt increasingly like a narrow corridor leading toward an inevitable end. Love, he believed, had passed him by. Twice he had failed with Felice Bauer. Attempts at intimacy left him exhausted and ashamed. He seemed destined to remain alone, and then, suddenly, a voice entered his life, Milena Jesenská. Milena was everything Kafka was not, vibrant, fearless, and alive. A Czech journalist and translator, married yet restless, she discovered Kafka through his stories and offered to translate them into Czech. Their relationship began in letters, as so many of Kafka's relationships did, but what followed was unlike anything he had experienced before. From the very first exchanges, their words burned with intensity. Kafka poured himself into his letters to Milena with a desperation that astonished even him. He confessed his fears, his longings, his dreams, his dread of death. "I belong to you," he wrote, "though I do not deserve to." He described her as fire, as salvation, as the only person who could truly see him. Milena, for her part, responded with passion and understanding. She called him her beloved, her Franz, her mirror. In her, Kafka felt for the first time the possibility of being known and loved completely. And yet, as always with Kafka, love was a battlefield of contradictions. Milena was married, though unhappily. To be with her would mean scandal, risk, upheaval. Kafka, ever timid, ever self-punishing, recoiled from such steps. His illness made him doubt he could ever be a true partner. He feared intimacy, feared the physical closeness that love demanded, feared the very happiness that seemed within reach. Their letters are filled with this oscillation, declarations of love followed by withdrawals into guilt and despair. The passion between them was undeniable. When they met in person in Vienna, Kafka was overwhelmed. Milena's presence electrified him, yet he could not escape his anxieties. He loved her, but he also feared her love, convinced that he could never sustain it. He described himself as weighed down by chains, incapable of being free enough to accept what she offered. Out of this feverish relationship emerged some of the most revealing documents Kafka ever wrote. The letters to Milena, later published after his death. They reveal him not as the distant prophet of absurdity, but as a man trembling with longing, tenderness, and fear. In them, we see the vulnerable Kafka, yearning to belong, yet terrified of being consumed. This impossible flame, like his engagement to Felice, eventually burned out. Milena, though she loved him, could not live on letters and fragments. She remained tied to her own life in Prague, her marriage, her work. Kafka withdrew, resigned once more to solitude, but the mark she left on him was indelible. To Milena, he had given his truest self, and through her, he glimpsed what love might have been had his body and his fears not betrayed him. At the same time, his illness worsened. His lungs weakened, his throat burned, his weight plummeted. The tuberculosis now attacked his larynx, making it painful to swallow, nearly impossible to eat. The man who had written The Hunger Artist, a story of a performer who starves himself in a cage because he cannot find food that satisfies him, was now living his own allegory. Food became agony, his body wasting away, his art consuming him more than ever. Milena remained in his life through correspondence, her letters a lifeline, but Kafka knew their love could never become a reality. It existed in words, like his entire life, written, imagined, but never fully lived. And yet, those words glowed like embers, warming him in the cold nights of his illness. Thus ended the last great love affair of Kafka's life, a relationship more intense than any physical union, more real in ink than it ever could be in flesh. He had found fire, but it was a fire he dared not touch, for fear it would consume him completely. The question that remained was cruel. Had he lived more in those letters than in his entire life? And if love was only possible for him on paper, what did that say about the man who had made words his only world? By 1922, Franz Kafka's body was failing rapidly. Tuberculosis had advanced from his lungs into his throat. Swallowing became painful, each bite of food a torment, each attempt to nourish himself a reminder of his own approaching death. His frame grew skeletal, his face gaunt, his voice faint, and yet, in the very years when his body was collapsing, his imagination surged with a final intensity. It was as if he were racing against the grave, pouring onto paper the visions that would outlast his fragile flesh. During this time, he began his most haunting, unfinished novel, The Castle. The story follows a land surveyor, known only as K, who arrives in a village dominated by a mysterious castle. K tries desperately to gain access, to prove his purpose, to be recognized by the authorities that rule from above. But every attempt is frustrated. He encounters endless delays, contradictory orders, evasive officials, opaque rules. The castle looms in the distance, visible but unreachable, a symbol of power that cannot be confronted and of meaning that forever recedes. Writing The Castle was, for Kafka, both confession and prophecy. The bureaucracy he described was not only the empire around him, but the illness inside him. An authority inscrutable, implacable, that condemned him without reason and without appeal. Just as Joseph K. in the trial never learned his crime, K. in the castle never gained entry to the truth. Kafka himself, writing feverishly in his sickbed, sensed that his own life was following the same script, an endless search for meaning that would end unfinished. Alongside The Castle, Kafka produced shorter, sharper pieces, each like a shard of his suffering turned into art. In 1922, he wrote A Hunger Artist, the story of a man whose art is fasting, who starves himself in a cage while crowds gather to watch. At first admired, the artist is later ignored until he confesses at the brink of death that he never fasted out of discipline or art, but because he never found food he could enjoy. The allegory was almost unbearable in its clarity. Kafka himself was wasting away, unable to swallow, his own body mirroring the fate of his fictional hunger artist. He also wrote parables, brief, enigmatic texts like lightning flashes in the dark. In them, readers glimpse his obsessions distilled to their essence: guilt, authority, futility, the absurdity of existence. His writing had always been urgent. Now it was a matter of survival. Each word seemed torn from his failing body, each page a protest against silence. During this time, Kafka moved often between sanatoriums and spas, seeking relief in mountain air, hoping for respite in nature. In 1923, he traveled to Berlin, where he met Dora Diamant, a young woman who became his final companion. Dora was devoted, warm, protective. She nursed him in his weakness, comforted him in his despair, and shared with him a vision of simple, spiritual life. With Dora, Kafka experienced a fragile peace he had never known before, a late and fleeting tenderness at the edge of death. Yet even this comfort was shadowed by fate. His illness advanced relentlessly. Eating became impossible. He lived on milk, soft foods, liquids, and even these caused agony. Each day was a slow form of suffocation, each night an encounter with pain that no words could capture. Still, he wrote. Still, he filled notebooks with fragments, letters, thoughts. What Kafka did not know, or perhaps feared, was that these final, unfinished works would secure his immortality. The castle ended abruptly, with K still stranded outside the gates. A Hunger Artist ended with death in the cage. His fragments spoke of trials and condemnations without conclusion, and so his literature, like his life, would remain unresolved, forever suspended in ambiguity. By the spring of 1924, Kafka was nearly voiceless, his throat ravaged. Doctors placed him in a sanatorium near Vienna, where Dora and his closest friends, including Max Brod, visited him. He could barely speak above a whisper. Each breath was labor. Each attempt to swallow brought pain. The man who had given the world words now found his own body silencing him, but silence did not erase the vision. The manuscripts lay in piles beside his bed, pages filled with the nightmarish clarity of a man who had seen too deeply, and as Kafka weakened, another question loomed, unspoken but inescapable. Would these manuscripts survive him, or would his wish for destruction prevail? On June 3, 1924, Franz Kafka breathed his last in a sanatorium near Vienna. He was only 40 years old, a man worn down by tuberculosis, his body wasted to the point of invisibility. Dora Diamant, his final companion, had been by his side, holding his hand as he slipped into the silence that had long haunted him. To the world, his passing barely registered. Newspapers printed only small notices. He was not famous, not celebrated. He died as he had lived, quietly, on the margins. But Kafka did not leave only his frail body behind. He left a will, and in it a shocking command. He instructed his closest friend and literary executor Max Brod to burn all his unpublished manuscripts, his novels, his diaries, his letters, his countless fragments, everything reduced to ash. Kafka had always considered himself a failure, his works unfinished, flawed, unworthy of survival. He wanted oblivion, not immortality. Max Brod faced an impossible choice. He had been Kafka's confidant since university, the one who believed in him when Kafka himself did not. He had watched him labor night after night, pouring his soul into words that he judged too harshly. Brod was convinced that Kafka's writings were not the broken fragments of a neurotic man, but revelations, works of genius that exposed the absurd machinery of modern life like nothing else. To obey Kafka's command would mean destroying the voice of a generation before it could even be heard. To disobey meant betraying his dearest friend's final wish. Brod chose betrayal. In the months and years after Kafka's death, Brod began preparing the manuscripts for publication. He sorted through the boxes and notebooks, deciphered Kafka's cramped handwriting, and assembled the incomplete drafts of the novels. The Trial was the first to appear in 1925, followed by The Castle in 1926, and America, also known as The Man Who Disappeared, in 1927. Though unfinished, these works shook the literary world. Critics and readers alike felt that Kafka had given shape to something they had always sensed but never named: the absurdity of existence in a world of invisible powers and endless judgments. The Trial, with its faceless courts and meaningless hearings, was seen as a parable for modern oppression. The Castle, with its unreachable authority, became a symbol of alienation and futility. Even America, written earlier, captured the dislocation of the immigrant experience, the sense of never belonging. Together, these novels formed a mirror of the 20th century, a century that was already slipping into authoritarianism, war, and bureaucratic nightmares. At the same time, Brod began publishing Kafka's diaries, letters, and short stories. The world discovered not only the prophet of absurdity, but the fragile, yearning man behind the vision, the son crushed by his father, the lover incapable of intimacy, the patient fighting death, the writer who doubted every word. Far from diminishing him, these revelations made him even more compelling. Readers recognized in Kafka not a distant genius, but a fellow sufferer, someone who articulated the anxieties they themselves carried in silence. As the work spread, Kafka's reputation grew. Within a decade, he was no longer obscure. His name became a phenomenon. People began to use a new word, Kafkaesque, to describe situations that felt like his stories. labyrinthine bureaucracies, senseless trials, authority without face or reason. The very nightmares he scribbled in his notebooks now became part of the vocabulary of the modern world. Yet the irony was unbearable. Kafka, who had feared exposure more than anything, was now everywhere. The man who begged for silence was transformed into a prophet. The writer who saw himself as failure became one of the most influential authors of the century. Max Brod's betrayal had given him the immortality he himself had refused. But the question lingered like a ghost. If Kafka had seen this fate, would he have thanked Brod or condemned him to the very trial he had so often imagined? In the years that followed Max Brod's decision to publish the manuscripts, something extraordinary happened. Franz Kafka, the quiet clerk who had died believing himself a failure, began to rise like a ghost over Europe. The fragments, the unfinished novels, the jagged parables that he had dismissed as unworthy, these became revelations to a world stumbling into chaos. By the late 1920s, intellectuals in Berlin, Vienna, and Paris were reading The Trial and the Castle with astonishment. They found in Joseph K's endless hearings and K as futile attempts to reach the castle, the essence of modern life. A world where power was everywhere yet nowhere, where rules existed but could not be understood, where guilt was assumed without cause. Kafka's imagination seemed less like fiction and more like prophecy. As the 1930s unfolded, history itself conspired to prove him right. In Stalin's Soviet Union, men and women were arrested in the middle of the night, accused of crimes they could not comprehend and forced to confess before faceless tribunals. In Nazi Germany, laws turned citizens into suspects overnight, reducing lives to files, documents, and numbers. Suddenly, Kafka's visions no longer felt metaphorical, they felt documentary. When people spoke of secret police, endless interrogations, and bureaucratic absurdities, they reached instinctively for a new word: Kafkaesque. Writers and philosophers rushed to claim him as one of their own. Albert Camus saw in Kafka's novels the perfect reflection of the absurd condition, the human being searching for meaning in a universe that gives none. Jean-Paul Sartre read Kafka as an existentialist avant la lettre, an author who revealed the anguish of freedom and the inevitability of despair. Thomas Mann admired the crystalline precision of his prose, which cut through illusions like a surgeon's knife. For the philosophers of the Frankfurt School, Walter Benjamin, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, Kafka was no longer just an artist. He was a seer, exposing the dehumanizing logic of modern bureaucracies and authoritarian regimes. His worlds of trials and castles mirrored the industrial machinery of oppression already tightening across Europe. At the same time, artists of all kinds took inspiration. Playwrights adapted his stories for the stage, turning his parables into dramas of alienation. Painters and sculptors sought to capture the insect body of Gregor Samsa or the looming presence of the castle. Filmmakers found in his works the blueprint for cinematic nightmares: corridors without end, doors that lead to nowhere, authority without face. And in Prague itself, the city that had once ignored him, a strange reverence began to grow. He had been a German-speaking Jew in a predominantly Czech city, belonging fully to no community. In life, he had been peripheral, almost invisible. In death, everyone claimed him. Germans insisted he was theirs. Czechs hailed him as a son of Prague. Jews recognized in him the eternal outsider. Kafka himself, who never felt at home anywhere, was now a citizen of the world. By the time the Second World War ended, Kafka's reputation had transformed into legend. He was no longer just a writer. He was a myth, a name that signified an entire way of understanding the modern world. To call something Kafkaesque was to evoke not only absurdity but dread, guilt, futility, the sense of being trapped in a labyrinth with no exit. It was the cruelest irony of all. Kafka had begged Max Brod to burn his words, to erase him from memory, to spare him the exposure he dreaded. Instead, his voice became one of the loudest of the century, echoing long after his death. The man who thought himself condemned to obscurity was resurrected as a prophet of modern anxiety. But perhaps this irony was fitting. Kafka's characters were always caught in contradictions, guilty without guilt, alive yet already condemned, outsiders even in their own homes. Kafka himself became one more such paradox, dead yet impossibly present, silent yet speaking everywhere. Still, the haunting question remained. If Kafka had foreseen this transformation, if he had known that his nightmares would one day become the mirror of the modern age, would he have seen it as vindication or as a final, merciless trial? After the Second World War, as Europe lay in ruins and the world confronted the horror of concentration camps, show trials, and totalitarian control, Franz Kafka's voice rose louder than ever. The man who had died in obscurity, whispering his last words in a sanatorium, now spoke across continents. His stories were not just literature anymore, they were prophecy, a diagnosis of the century's disease. In the United States, universities embraced the trial and the metamorphosis as essential texts for understanding modern anxiety. Students discovered in Joseph K. senseless condemnation, the same fear they felt in a world threatened by nuclear annihilation, faceless corporations, and Cold War paranoia. In Europe, Kafka became inseparable from existentialism. Albert Camus declared that his works illustrated the absurd more vividly than any philosophy could. Jean-Paul Sartre saw in him the terror of freedom and the futility of rebellion. Philosophers went further. Hannah Arendt, writing on the banality of evil and the machinery of totalitarian states, found Kafka's vision eerily aligned with reality. The faceless clerks, the endless paperwork, the rules without reason. Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari proclaimed that Kafka had invented a minor literature, one that spoke from the margins of identity, Jewish, German-speaking, Czech, transforming fragility into power. His fragmented, hybrid voice, they argued, was the future of literature itself. Beyond philosophy, his influence seeped into politics and culture. Activists described oppressive regimes as Kafkaesque, invoking his name whenever individuals were crushed by impersonal systems. Journalists used the term to describe prisoners lost in legal limbo, refugees trapped in bureaucratic mazes, citizens erased by their own governments. Kafka, who never sought to be political, became one of the most political writers of the 20th century, simply because his nightmares matched reality too closely. And then there was art. Filmmakers such as Orson Welles adapted The Trial for the screen, filling it with looming shadows and endless corridors that looked exactly as readers had imagined. Writers like Jorge Luis Borges found in Kafka a fellow architect of labyrinths and infinite regress. Magical realists such as Gabriel Garcia Marquez and later Haruki Murakami carried forward his blend of the ordinary and the surreal, where a man could wake as an insect or wander through a world of shifting laws without explanation. Kafka's reach was not confined to high art. His name appeared in newspapers, in politics, in casual conversation. Kafkaesque entered everyday speech, shorthand for situations both absurd and terrifying. An applicant trapped in visa paperwork, a citizen accused by secret courts, a patient navigating endless insurance claims. Kafka had become more than an author. He was a vocabulary, a lens, a way of naming the modern condition. Meanwhile, Prague, the city that had once barely noticed him, claimed him as a son. Museums and monuments rose in his honor. Tourists traced his footsteps through the Jewish quarter, the streets he walked to work, the apartment where he wrote into the night. A bronze statue in the city center captured him as a small figure riding on the shoulders of a headless giant, an image as strange and unsettling as his stories. Kafka, the exile in life, became a monument in death. Yet the irony of his posthumous fame never faded. He had begged for destruction, and instead he was resurrected as a prophet. He had doubted every line he wrote, yet those very lines became immortal. He had feared exposure, yet now his diaries, his confessions, even his most private letters were published and dissected. His intimacy was on display for the world he had tried to escape. By the mid-20th century, Kafka had become unavoidable. In literature, in philosophy, in politics, in art, his shadow loomed everywhere. He was no longer just Franz Kafka of Prague. He was Kafka, the name of an entire worldview, a shorthand for dread, alienation, and absurdity. And yet beneath the myth, the paradox persisted. Was this the immortality Kafka deserved, or the punishment he most feared? Nearly a century after his death, Franz Kafka has never been more alive. His stories, once whispered in the solitude of Prague nights, are now echoed in every corner of the world. To read Kafka today is to hold a mirror to the 21st century, to see in his parables not the relics of an old world, but the blueprint of our own. The word Kafkaesque has escaped the confines of literature. It surfaces in headlines about refugees lost in endless immigration processes, about citizens trapped in opaque legal systems, about employees suffocated by corporate bureaucracy. In airports, hospitals, government offices, in the very architecture of modern life, Kafka's vision is present. The faceless clerk, the sealed door, the circular rule that binds without explanation. When people say, "This is Kafkaesque," they mean they are living his nightmare in real time. In the digital age, his relevance has only sharpened. Kafka wrote of invisible authorities. Today we call them algorithms. He imagined courts without faces. Now we confront automated decisions that determine credit, travel, even guilt. He described men trapped in labyrinths. Now we wander through online systems, guided by codes we do not understand, governed by powers we cannot see. If Kafka were alive, he would recognize the internet as yet another castle, vast, omnipresent, and ultimately unreachable. But his legacy is not only one of dread. For readers across the world, Kafka remains strangely consoling. His characters suffer, fail, and collapse, but in their very suffering lies recognition. He shows us the truth we try to avoid, that existence is fragile, absurd, often cruel. Yet by writing it, by naming it, he transforms it into something bearable. Millions who feel alone in their anxiety, their alienation, their sense of not belonging, find in Kafka a companion across time. He does not heal them, but he tells them they are not alone. In literature, his influence is immeasurable. From Camus to Murakami, from Borges to Philip Roth, generations of writers have drawn from his spare, precise, haunting style. In philosophy, his name continues to surface in debates about freedom, authority, and the absurd. In politics, his stories are invoked whenever governments overreach, whenever justice twists into cruelty, whenever a human being is lost in the gears of a machine. Even in popular culture, Kafka lingers. His imagery, Gregor Samsa waking as an insect, Joseph K., led to his senseless execution. The castle looming in the distance appears in films, paintings, comics, music. His nightmares have become part of the collective imagination. And in Prague, the city that once overlooked him, his presence is everywhere. Statues rise in his honor, his name draws pilgrims, his words are etched into plaques and monuments. Tourists walk the alleys he once despised, chasing a ghost who never felt at home there. Kafka, the eternal exile, has become a monument in the very city that never claimed him in life. The irony remains unbearable and yet fitting. Kafka wanted silence, and he received immortality. He wanted oblivion, and he became universal. He wanted his words burned, and instead they became sacred texts of modernity. Like Joseph K., like Gregor Samsa, he never escaped his trial, but his trial became ours. Franz Kafka will never rest, because we will never stop needing him. As long as there are faceless authorities, impossible labyrinths, invisible judgments, and the gnawing question of meaning, his voice will whisper in our ears. He is the writer of dread, but also the writer of truth. The truth that life is absurd, but that in naming the absurd, we find a fragile kind of dignity. Kafka today is not just an author. He is a condition, a way of seeing, a presence. He is the eternal exile who found in exile a place that belongs to everyone. And so the story ends where it began, in a small, frightened boy in Prague, crushed under the shadow of his father, scribbling words in silence. He believed those words would vanish. Instead, they became immortal. Kafka himself could never enter the castle, but through his words, humanity has entered a darker, stranger, and truer vision of its own.